being done in these two quadrants to think through substitution and smart contracts and other transformative applications. But we're still in the early days for that. And you can imagine, just in the world of smart contracts, like, how will we verify the computational logic of those smart contracts? You think about sort of bugs now in databases, bugs now in software, right? Or the disasters that happened 2 weeks ago when British Airways, somebody pulled a power plug and the entire British Airways network collapsed. Those things will become even more important. Secondly, our lawyers will have to become coders. Right? They will actually have to understand what it is that is underlying this, and same with our legal system and our accounting system to figure out how smart contracts will work. There's another question from the audience.
So we're getting a couple of questions about how secure is blockchain technology. Stephen wants to know, what's your opinion of blockchain's vulnerability to DDoS type of attacks?
Great. So the question is about security. And I think, look, we will forever be living in the shadow of cybersecurity moving forward. If you want job security, you should go to the security industry and build up skills in that space. So the technology for blockchain itself uses cryptographic and computational puzzles to ensure that the blocks in the blockchain, so think of, again, of the transactions that are happening on a ledger, right? That these transactions are linked together by the chain. This is the blockchain aspect. That these transactions are locked forever in the blockchain itself. Now, that doesn't mean that if somebody with a super computational power couldn't come in and try to hack this and make it and reverse some transactions. But that will require an inordinate amount of computational power that potentially maybe even state actors may not be able to muster to unwind the transactions that have taken place in the blockchain. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that at the present time, the speed of by which a transaction clears takes time. Right, takes more time than how a credit card network works. And so we're seeing the evolution of the technology. I'm going to give it time for it to work. But the question about distributed denial of service attacks means that, could it be the case that if we were attacking, all the nodes on the blockchain, would that work? Now, the whole notion of blockchain is that there's no centralized node, so you wouldn't be able to block the blockchain from taking place. You might attack at certain nodes, but other nodes may come in. But we're still, again, in the early days of blockchain implementation, and I think security is going to be a big area for us to go after. So look, we've covered how does it apply to my business, how to think about the ways in which the evolution of the applications of blockchain are going to evolve. And again, I want to emphasize to you that don't think about the technology, think about the application. For all of us in the business world, this is where the action is going to be. Finally, I want to go to where should you begin? But before I do that, there's a question from the audience.
And I think this is tied to your next point. So we're getting a lot of questions about applications of blockchain. Do you see it being used in healthcare and education, in HR? But Rajashri wants to know, what is the strategy an organization can follow to become an early adopter of blockchain technology? How do I know if my business should investigate it?
That's a great question. So let me, I'm just going to erase this. And let's talk about where to begin and how to begin. So in many ways, all organizations keep records and keep track of transactions taking place between people to people, business to businesses, businesses to people, machines to machines, businesses to machines. And so the place to look for is record keeping, right? And again, this sounds so boring, right? Like record keeping, like how could that be the next sexy technology? But that is, in fact, the element which is foundational to the blockchain, that it can keep track of transactions in ways that are important. Now, the way to start thinking about it is, can you imagine, all the applications, all the uses of record keeping, and where they're being done, and then from there start to think about where is there a coordination burden? Where would it be useful if, in fact, the records themselves, the ledger, right? So the record keeping goes to a ledger. The ledger itself could be shared, right? If all of a sudden you could share the ledger with other parties, then all of a sudden you can start to imagine that this is going to have, beginning to have some value for you. So this becomes the first way for you to start thinking about how to identify applications. So I've seen things like people are building internal databases of IT assets on the blockchain. Why? Because right now there are 35 different spreadsheets, over 20 different organizations that are keeping track of every printer, every monitor, every server, right? And it's a mess. You could imagine all of that just sitting on a blockchain implementation internally inside of an organization. Even there, you don't even need to worry about interacting with third parties. Here is just an internal application. So the way to think about this is first identify the applications that you think are low-hanging fruit for you to try. Then there is, build the prototype. There are so many tools now available online where a competent person in technology, in IT, could start to build the first set of prototypes. And again, this for me reminds me so much of how open source got started, right? It was basically engineers in IT departments downloading Linux, trying things out, and all of a sudden they were building a distributed printer network, distributed file system based on Linux technologies. So start to build prototypes, right? The third thing is identify, right, organization change. As soon as you change the logic of the ledger, as soon as you change the logic of how records are being kept and who keeps them, you're going to run into organizational change efforts. And so this becomes important because as you show your prototypes to your senior managers, you will also have to discuss identification of organizational change, how processes within organizations may start to change given this approach. And then finally, scale to outside of your organization. Because I really think that this is where the real benefits of blockchain will come. When you can take this notion of the ledger and apply it as an open ledger available to important parties in your ecosystem, that you can start to build trust with each other by having a shared open ledger system take place. Now, that doesn't mean you're going to be out in the public internet, right? Because just as you have a local area network, you have a VPN, right? You have the same thing with blockchain. You can have private chains that are only connecting certain people, certain organizations together, and that can also take place. So this is a way for you to start to think about applications within the organizations that you work in. And what I would say to you is that the time to experiment is now. The time to experiment is within the ability to experiment is within your grasp. You can actually do this with the teams inside of your organizations. And if you can just build prototypes and demonstrate to your executives how this works, then you can start to demonstrate value for it. There's another viewer question for us.
Yes, so Kareem is asking if you could talk about the risks and challenges of adopting blockchain.
Yeah, so risks and challenges. First of all, one of the challenges is going to be like this, the notion that you would have an open ledger that anybody could access is mind-blowing, right? Like we can't imagine, ledgers are the most secret things that we keep under lock and key in most organizations, right? And now what we're saying is that we're going to flip the logic around. We're going to have our transactions between people inside of organizations, across organizations, be available on an open ledger. This actually is mind-blowing, and we expect a lot of resistance from executives to imagine this world take place. So I think that's a big challenge that I think people will need to overcome. The fact that we're seeing banks adopt and embrace blockchain gives me some solace that if these conservative institutions can figure out how to adopt this technology and use it for their own purposes, then potentially the rest of us who are not as conservative as these banks may be able to also make the case inside of organization. But I think that's one of the biggest challenges. I think the risk is really going to be twofold. The risk is going to be technology risk. We're at the start of lots of companies coming up with their own implementation of blockchain. There's an explosion of startups. And how do you pick the right winner for the blockchain technology for you to pioneer? There I would look more and more for companies and for organizations that are pushing open source, pushing technologies that are easily available, and build on those, because they will have potentially a higher risk of surviving than the 75th version of blockchain technology that some startup may be doing. But the other risk is really, I think, related to your ability as an organization to implement these technologies, right? And that, I think, is also a risk for most companies thinking about blockchain. There's another question by a viewer.
So one viewer is asking, so you say the real benefits of blockchain come from scaling it to other stakeholders in an ecosystem, but it sounds like deriving new blocks becomes more and more computationally intensive as the chain gets longer over time. So in practical applications, do you see this causing any scale problems with blockchain-based applications?
Yes, I think that's a great question. What I'm observing is that the leading minds in computer science are taking this view of saying, are there other proof of concept, proof of work algorithms available that are not as computationally intensive? And so the system like something called Stellar, which is based on the blockchain but has a different proof of work concept, has been pioneered, has been used in payments in Africa and in developing countries. So what I would sort of say there is that, like most technologies, if you went back to the 70s and looked at TCP/IP then, you would not have imagined the world of you being able to FaceTime with your mom across the world. Similarly, what we see today is not going to be the state of technology 5 years from now, 10 years from now. And I think what's happening is that there's a ton of both investment,